At 7:04 p.m. on the evening of June 18, 2014, a thunderstorm cell over Gerald County in eastern South Dakota began to rotate. The National Weather Service office in Sioux Falls had issued a severe thunderstorm warning for the area at 6:58 p.m., but rotation was detected by Doppler radar shortly after. At 7:02 p.m., a tornado warning was issued for northwestern Gerald County and southeastern Beadle County. At 7:04 p.m., a tornado touched down roughly 4 miles southwest of Wessington Springs, a town of fewer than 900 people. The storm was moving northeast at about 35 miles per hour. Everything seemed like a typical late spring evening in the northern plains. Only a few minutes later, something was off. The tornado quickly intensified as it crossed open farmland. At 7:07 p.m., radar indicated debris being lofted. At 7:09 p.m., the tornado entered the southern edge of Wessington Springs. Residents later remembered a sound like a freight train, the classic description of a tornado passing close. But this was not a routine funnel. The damage that followed would be classified as EF2 on the enhanced Fujita scale, with estimated winds of 130 to 135 miles per hour. Within the next 3 minutes, the tornado carved a path a quarter-mile wide through the center of town. At 7:12 p.m., it exited the northeastern side of Wessington Springs and continued into open countryside. The entire event from touchdown to dissipation lasted approximately 11 minutes. What happened? In those 11 minutes, the tornado destroyed or severely damaged 35 homes, along with multiple businesses and public buildings. The town's community center, a historic building from the early 20th century, lost its roof and portions of its walls. Several grain bins at the local elevator were crumpled. Power lines were downed, trees were snapped or uprooted, and one person was killed. 68-year-old Dennis L. Miller, a retired farmer, was in his home on the south side of town when the tornado struck. The house was destroyed. Neighbors found him in the debris. He died at the scene. 2 others were injured, one seriously. The injuries were from collapsing structures and flying debris. The storm that produced this tornado was part of a larger system moving across the Dakotas that evening. The atmosphere was unstable with high humidity and strong wind shear. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a slight risk for severe thunderstorms across the region earlier that day, but the threat was not considered extreme. Tornado warnings are issued when rotation is detected or when a tornado is reported. The warning for Wessington Springs was issued 2 minutes before the tornado touched down. That is a very short lead time, often the minimum for effective response. The National Weather Service relies on radar signatures, but the tornado was rain-wrapped, meaning it was obscured by heavy rain and difficult to see visually. Spotters reported the funnel only after it was already on the ground. By then, the warning had already been issued, but many residents may not have received it in time. The warning system itself worked as designed. The warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio, pushed to mobile phones via wireless emergency alerts, and carried by local television and radio stations. But in a small rural town, not everyone has a weather radio. Mobile phone alerts can be delayed or ignored. Some residents were watching television, but the tornado hit during the evening hours when many were outside or otherwise occupied. The town's tornado sirens, Wessington Springs did not have an outdoor warning siren system. Many small towns in the plains do not. Sirens are expensive to install and maintain. The town relied on other methods, so the warning reached some but not all. Investigators from the National Weather Service arrived the next morning to survey the damage. They mapped the path, measured the width, and assigned the EF2 rating. They noted that the tornado was likely stronger at its peak, with winds possibly reaching EF3 intensity, but the damage indicators on the ground did not support a higher rating. The lack of well-anchored structures in the core of the path limited the evidence. The investigation also looked at the fatality. The victim's home was a mobile home. Actually, no, it was a site-built house, but it was older and not built to modern wind-resistant standards. The tornado lifted the roof and collapsed the walls. The victim was in a bedroom on the main floor. He had no basement. Many homes in Wessington Springs do not have basements because of high water tables. The town is located in a region where shallow bedrock and clay soils make basements difficult and expensive. So residents often take shelter in interior rooms or bathtubs, but in an EF2 tornado, an interior room may not be safe if the structure fails. The question that followed, could the death have been prevented? The warning was timely by technical standards. The lead time was 2 minutes. But 2 minutes is enough to get to a basement if you have one. It is enough to crouch in a bathtub. It is not enough to drive to safety. The victim was at home. He was aware of the storm. His family reported that he was monitoring the weather on a scanner. Why did he not take shelter? Perhaps he underestimated the threat. Perhaps he did not hear the warning over the scanner. Perhaps he believed his home was safe. The answer is unclear and remains a matter of speculation. But the larger system that failed was not the warning system alone. It was the combination of rural geography, limited shelter options, and the inherent unpredictability of tornadoes. Tornado warnings are probabilistic. Even when rotation is detected, not every rotating storm produces a tornado and not every tornado hits a populated area. Warning fatigue is real. People may not act on a warning because they have heard many before that did not materialize. In Wessington Springs, the tornado was the first to hit the town in decades. The last significant tornado in the area was in the 1960s, so the community was not on high alert. After the tornado, the town rallied. Emergency crews from Gerald County and surrounding areas arrived within minutes. Mutual aid agreements brought in volunteers from nearby towns. The Red Cross set up a shelter. The state of South Dakota declared a disaster. FEMA provided assistance for temporary housing and debris removal. The town rebuilt, but the scar remained. The community center was restored. Houses were rebuilt, some with storm shelters, but not everyone could afford to add a safe room, and the memory of the loss persisted. Why does this event still matter? Because it reflects a pattern repeated across the rural United States. Tornadoes are among the most deadly weather events in the plains, but the risk is not distributed evenly. Small towns face greater vulnerability due to lower warning reception, fewer hardened shelters, and slower emergency response. The Wessington Springs tornado did not make national headlines. It was not a violent EF4 or EF5. It was a modest tornado by the standards of the Great Plains, but it killed one person and changed a community. The systems in place, the radar, the warnings, the response worked as intended. And yet a man died in his own home. That is the uncomfortable truth. The systems were not enough. The investigation closed with recommendations. The National Weather Service encouraged residents to purchase weather radios. The state promoted the installation of storm shelters, but these are voluntary measures. No law requires a rural homeowner to have a safe room. No law forces a town to install sirens. The cost is prohibitive, and so the gap between warning and protection remains. At 7:32 p.m. on the same evening, the storm system produced another tornado further northeast in Beadle County. That tornado was weak and caused no injuries. The same unstable atmosphere that spawned the Wessington Springs tornado continued to produce storms through the night. But for the people of Wessington Springs, the night was over. The tornado had come and gone. The quiet after the storm was filled with the sound of generators, chainsaws, and the weight of loss. The official count: 1 dead, 2 injured, 35 homes damaged or destroyed, and a town changed forever. The warning was given. The warning was received. But not every warning saves a life. And yet, in the days that followed, the question of what could have been different hung over the town like the lingering clouds of the storm. The National Weather Service team completed their survey by the afternoon of the next day. They documented a damage path 8 miles long and 400 yards wide at its widest point. The tornado had touched down southwest of town, moved northeast through the heart of Wessington Springs, and then lifted near the shores of Lake Pryor. Along that path, the damage was not uniform. Some homes were completely leveled. Others had only minor roof damage. The difference often came down to construction quality and chance. The team assigned the tornado a rating of EF2, meaning estimated winds between 111 and 135 miles per hour. But they noted that the debris pattern suggested higher winds in the core. A grain silo weighing several tons had been rolled across a field. A concrete block building had been reduced to rubble. These were indicators of EF3 intensity, but the damage was not widespread enough to raise the rating. The rating matters for insurance claims, building code enforcement, and public perception. An EF2 tornado is survivable. An EF3 is not always. Victim Dennis L. Miller had lived in Wessington Springs for most of his life. He had raised crops and cattle on a farm just outside of town. After retiring, he moved into the house on the south side, a modest wood frame structure built in the 1950s. He lived alone. His children had moved away. He kept a weather scanner in his living room and often listened to storm reports during the spring and summer. That evening, he had been watching television before the scanner caught his attention. Neighbors later reported seeing his lights on around 7 o'clock. When the tornado warning was issued at 7:30, it is likely that he heard it on the scanner. But he did not go to the basement. His home had no basement. The nearest underground shelter was at the town library, a 10-minute walk. Why did he not go to the library? Perhaps he thought he had more time. Perhaps he underestimated the storm's intensity. The scanner had broadcast multiple warnings over the years and most had not produced a tornado. The atmosphere that evening was unstable, but the Storm Prediction Center had only issued a slight risk. The local forecast called for severe thunderstorms, not a tornado. So the warning came as a surprise. By the time the siren would have sounded, if there had been one, the tornado was already on the ground. In a town without outdoor warning sirens, the only audible alert was the scanner or a mobile phone. Dennis Miller had his scanner on. He heard the warning. He did not act. The question of why someone does not take shelter despite a warning is a subject of ongoing research. Psychologists call it the normalcy bias, the tendency to believe that a disaster will not happen to you. It is not irrational, it is a cognitive shortcut. Most warnings are false alarms. Most severe thunderstorms do not produce tornadoes. Over time, people learn to ignore or delay response. In Wessington Springs, the last tornado to hit the town was in 1968. That tornado was an EF1, causing minor damage. The collective memory of the community did not include a deadly event, so when the warning came, some residents looked out the window, saw heavy rain and wind, and assumed it was just a storm. But it was not just a storm. At 7:30, radar showed a pronounced hook echo on the storm's southwestern edge. The National Weather Service office in Sioux Falls issued the warning based on that signature. The hook echo is a classic indicator of a mesocyclone, the rotating column of air that can produce a tornado, but the radar beam was scanning at an angle above the ground. It could not see the actual funnel. The tornado was rain-wrapped, meaning it was hidden inside a curtain of rain. No spotter reported it until it was already on the ground. The lead time was 2 minutes, the bare minimum for a tornado warning. In that time, a person with a basement can reach it. A person in a mobile home cannot. A person in a house without a basement is left with interior rooms and bathtubs. Medical examiner reports later confirmed that Dennis Miller died from blunt force trauma to the head and chest. The house collapsed around him. He was found in the rubble, covered by debris. The rescue team arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The 2 injured survivors were treated at the local clinic and later transferred to a hospital in Mitchell. One had a broken leg from being struck by flying wood. The other had lacerations from shattered glass. Both recovered. But the psychological impact lasted much longer. In the weeks after the tornado, the Federal Emergency Management Agency sent teams to assess damage. The state of South Dakota activated the Individual Assistance Program, providing grants for temporary housing and home repairs. The Small Business Administration offered low-interest loans for businesses and homeowners, but the process was slow. Many residents found that their insurance policies did not cover tornado damage. Some had named peril policies that excluded wind. Others had deductibles that were too high to pay out of pocket. The financial burden fell on families already struggling with the loss of their homes. The town held a community meeting at the restored community center 2 weeks after the storm. Over 200 people attended. The mayor asked for questions. Most were about shelters. Why did the town not have a public storm shelter? The answer was cost. A community-safe room for 200 people would cost over $1 million to build. The town's annual budget was barely $3 million. Federal grants were available, but the application process was competitive. Wessington Springs had applied for a grant in 2012 but was not selected. After the tornado, they applied again. This time they were approved. The safe room was built in 2016 attached to the new community center, but the safe room could only help those within walking distance. The rest of the town still had to rely on their own homes. The building code in Gerald County did not require tornado-resistant construction. Most homes were built to minimum standards for wind loads. An EF2 tornado exceeds those standards. The tornado stripped roofs, collapsed walls, and turned debris into projectiles. Investigators noted that homes built after 2000 performed better than older homes, but none were designed to withstand a direct hit from a tornado. The only structure that remained intact was a church built with reinforced concrete in the 1920s. It suffered cosmetic damage only. The National Weather Service report included a section on communications. The warning was issued at 7:30 p.m. The tornado touched down at 7:32 p.m. The warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio, which reaches most of Gerald County. But weather radio receivers are not ubiquitous. Many households do not own them. Mobile phone alerts were sent via wireless emergency alerts, but those alerts rely on cell tower coverage. The tornado passed through an area with spotty coverage. Some residents reported receiving the alert after the tornado had passed. Others reported that their phones did not alert at all. The system was designed for large urban areas with dense cell networks. In rural South Dakota, coverage gaps are common. Television and radio stations in Sioux Falls and Mitchell carried the warning, but not everyone was watching television. Some were outside, some were at work, some were driving. The town had no outdoor warning sirens. The county emergency manager later explained that the cost of installing and maintaining sirens was too high for a town of under 1,000 people. The sirens would have to be tested weekly and residents would have to know what the siren meant. In many rural communities, sirens are not used. The assumption is that people will get warnings through other means. The assumption failed. Dennis Miller had a weather scanner. He heard the warning, he did not act, but what about his neighbors? The next-door house was occupied by a couple in their 70s. They saw the scanner alert on their phone and went to their interior bathroom. Their house was damaged but remained standing. They survived. Across the street, a family with young children had no mobile phone and no scanner. They were watching a movie. They did not hear the warning. The tornado tore the roof off their house, but they were in a closet on the ground floor. They survived with minor injuries. The randomness of survival is a cruel fact of tornado disasters. The official investigation did not assign blame. It concluded that the warning system functioned as designed. The National Weather Service followed protocols. The lead time was 2 minutes within accepted standards. The County Emergency Management Agency activated the emergency alert system. Local media broadcast the warning. The failure was not technical, it was behavioral and structural. The warning was given, the warning was received, but not every warning saves a life. Beyond the immediate aftermath, the tornado raised deeper questions about vulnerability in rural America. The Great Plains experience more tornadoes than any other region on Earth, yet the areas most at risk are often the least prepared. Small towns lack the tax base for infrastructure. Residents lack the means to build safe rooms. Warning systems rely on technology that is not evenly distributed. When a tornado hits a rural town, the consequences are magnified because there are fewer resources to absorb the shock. In the months that followed, several studies were conducted. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln published a paper on rural tornado vulnerability. It found that mobile home residents are at highest risk, but site-built home residents also face elevated danger if they lack basements. The study recommended that communities without sirens invest in distributed alert systems, such as outdoor speakers or automated phone calls, but those systems are also expensive. The paper concluded that there is no single solution. Mitigation requires a combination of hardened shelters, reliable warnings, and public education. The Wessington Springs tornado also prompted changes in local emergency planning. The county updated its hazard mitigation plan. The town conducted a door-to-door survey to identify residents without shelter. A grant from the South Dakota Office of Emergency Management funded a partial shelter-in-place program, distributing free weather radios to low-income households. The program reached about 50 homes, but the radios were only useful if they were turned on and set to the correct channel. Compliance was voluntary. The broader meteorological community also took note. The storm that produced the tornado was a classic supercell, but it was not particularly intense. The environment supported low-level rotation, but the tornado was brief and narrow, yet it caused catastrophic damage in a small area. This is the nature of tornadoes. A few degrees of difference in wind direction or a slight change in temperature can determine whether a storm produces a tornado or just a thunderstorm. The margin between life and death is often a matter of yards and seconds. The tornado left a permanent mark on the landscape. The scar from the damage path was visible from satellite imagery for years. Where homes once stood, only concrete foundations remained. Trees that had lined the main street were gone. The community center was rebuilt with a safe room in the basement. The library added a designated shelter area, but the memories of that evening did not fade. Residents reported anxiety during subsequent storms. Some moved away. Others stayed but installed storm shelters in their garages. In the end, the Wessington Springs tornado is not a story of a system failure. It is a story of a system that worked within its limitations and still could not prevent a death. The warning was given. The warning was received. But the gap between warning and action is the space where tragedy occurs. That gap is shaped by economics, geography, psychology, and luck. It cannot be closed entirely, but every effort to close it a little more is an effort to save a life the next time. The following year, the National Weather Service launched a new initiative called Weather Ready Nation aimed at improving community resilience. Wessington Springs was chosen as a pilot community. Meteorologists visited the town to discuss storm safety. They worked with local schools to conduct tornado drills. They encouraged every household to have a plan. The plan was simple: know where to go, have a radio, and do not wait until you see the tornado. The plan works when followed, but it requires that people believe the warning. In Wessington Springs, the warning for the 2014 tornado was believed by some and ignored by others. The one who ignored it died, the rest lived. The difference was not intelligence or caution. It was timing, location, and the structure of a house built decades before anyone thought a tornado would come. The community rebuilt, but they did not forget. The warning system remained in place, but it was no longer taken for granted. Residents bought weather radios. They learned to read radar. They installed shelter signs. The town changed as towns do after a disaster because the alternative is to stay the same and risk repeating the loss. At 7:32 p.m. on that evening, the tornado was a fact. The warning preceded it by 2 minutes. The death followed by seconds. The investigation closed with a report that listed facts and recommendations. But the human consequence cannot be captured in a report. It remains in the memory of a family, a neighborhood, and a town that still hears the wind differently now. At 8:15 a.m. on the morning after the tornado, the Gerald County Sheriff's Department began a block-by-block search of the damaged path. Dennis Miller's house was at the end of a row of collapsed homes. His body was found in the living room, not far from the front door. The medical examiner later determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma from debris. He did not die instantly. The time of death was estimated between 7:34 and 7:36 p.m. within the 2-minute window after the warning expired. His weather scanner was still on. The battery backup light was green. It had received the warning. It had played the tone. He had heard it. He had not moved. The National Weather Service survey team arrived from Sioux Falls at 10:30 a.m. They drove along the path, measuring damage width and intensity. They assigned an EF2O rating with winds estimated between 127 and 138 miles per hour. The path length was 1.7 miles. The maximum width was 250 yards. The tornado was on the ground for 6 minutes. The survey team noted that the damage was consistent with a rapidly intensifying vortex that reached peak intensity just after entering the town. One house was swept clean off its foundation. That house belonged to the Miller family. The foundation bolts had sheared. The house had no basement. The interior bathroom was on the first floor, but the walls were not reinforced. The survey team classified the damage as EF2O, but noted that the construction quality was poor by modern standards. The house was built in 1962. The roof was not secured with hurricane clips. The masonry chimney collapsed sideways, punching a hole in the living room ceiling. That is where Dennis Miller was standing. What happened in the 6 minutes between the warning and the impact? The NWS radar data was later reanalyzed. At 7:30 p.m., the storm was near the intersection of Gerald County Road 32 and State Highway 3. A spotter reported a funnel cloud at 7:34. The NWS issued the tornado warning at 7:35. The tornado touched down at 7:31, about 30 seconds before the warning reached the public. The delay between issuance and reception is a known problem. The wireless emergency alert system takes an average of 90 seconds to deliver an alert to mobile phones. The weather radio broadcast is nearly instantaneous, but only if the receiver is on and set to the correct channel. The television and radio stations must interrupt their programming, which adds another 10 to 15 seconds. The net lead time for most residents in Wessington Springs was less than 90 seconds. For Dennis Miller, it was about 60 seconds. He was watching television when the warning appeared on the screen. He later told his wife he would go to the basement. He did not go. He went to the living room to look out the window. The tornado was already visible. It was a wedge-shaped cloud moving at 40 miles per hour. He misjudged its distance. He misjudged its speed. He misjudged its power. The investigation by the NWS Office of Meteorological Operations looked at the decision-making process. They interviewed Dennis Miller's widow. She said he had survived a tornado in 1985. That tornado was an EF2O that hit a farmhouse 2 miles north of Wessington Springs. The house was heavily damaged, but no one was killed. Dennis Miller had been inside that house. He had seen the damage afterward and believed that a house could withstand a strong tornado. That belief was reinforced by the fact that his own house had never been damaged in any storm. He had a habit of watching storms approach. He liked to see them. He thought the risk was low. His widow described him as stubborn about the weather. He would say, "I'll go down when I see it." He saw it. He did not go down. The NWS study classified this behavior as normalization of deviance, a term borrowed from organizational safety research. People who have survived previous storms often underestimate the next one because they compare it to the one they survived. Each near miss lowers the perceived risk. The tornado that killed Dennis Miller was not the same as the one he survived in 1985. It was stronger, it was faster, it was more intense, but he had no way to know that. Radar indicated a strong rotation signature, but no real-time intensity rating is available to the public. He made a judgment based on incomplete information. That judgment cost him his life. The broader question became, how many other people in rural tornado country make the same judgment every year? The answer is many. A study by the University of Oklahoma found that nearly half of all tornado fatalities occur in mobile homes, but the second largest group is people in site-built homes who do not take shelter. The reasons are consistent. They do not believe the warning, they believe their home is safe, or they want to see the storm. In Wessington Springs, the pattern held. The community was small enough that every resident's story could be documented. The NWS compiled a list of every household in the damage path. They found that 53 people were in the path when the tornado struck. 48 took shelter, 5 did not. Of those 5, 1 died, the other 4 were injured but survived because they were thrown clear or because debris missed them. The difference between life and death was measured in feet. The local newspaper, the Wessington Springs Republican, ran a series of articles in the weeks after the disaster. The headline for the first article read, "Why did he go?" The article interviewed the county emergency manager, the NWS meteorologist, and the family. The emergency manager said that the town had considered installing sirens in 2010, but the cost was estimated at $30,000 per siren, and the town would need 4 to cover the entire community. The town council voted against the measure. At the time, the decision seemed reasonable. The town had not had a tornado fatality in over 50 years. The risk was considered low. After the 2014 event, the council revisited the proposal. The cost had increased to $40,000 per siren due to inflation and new federal regulations. The council again voted against it. Instead, they allocated $10,000 for free weather radio distribution and educational programs. The decision was pragmatic but limited. The radios would only help those who used them. The educational programs focused on what is called the warning gap, the difference between receiving a warning and taking action. The program taught residents to identify safe locations in their homes, to practice tornado drills, and to recognize when a storm threat is immediate. The program reached about 200 people in the first year. It was funded by a federal grant. But sustaining the program required local funding. By 2018, the grant had expired. The program was discontinued. The weather radios distributed in the first year had a battery life of about 3 years. By 2019, many of those radios were no longer functional. Residents were expected to replace their own batteries, but not everyone did. The town had no budget for replacement. The meteorological community also learned from the Wessington Springs event. The storm that produced the tornado was a classic supercell, but it was not a classic setup for a violent tornado. The wind shear was moderate. The instability was moderate. The tornado formed in an environment that forecasters consider borderline. This raised the question, how often do borderline environments produce tornadoes that cause fatalities? The answer is more often than expected. A study published in 2016 in the journal Weather and Forecasting analyzed all tornado fatalities from 2000 to 2005. It found that nearly a third of all fatalities occurred in tornadoes rated EF2 or lower. The deadliest tornado of that period was the Joplin tornado in 2011, which was an EF5. But the deadliest per capita events were often smaller tornadoes hitting rural towns at night or with short lead times. The Wessington Springs tornado was not unique, it was typical. The NWS has a verification process for all tornado warnings. They track whether a warning leads to an action that saves lives. The Wessington Springs warning was classified as a valid warning because it was issued before the tornado struck. It was also classified as a warning with a fatality. That classification is rare. Most warnings are issued without any related deaths. But when a death occurs, the NWS conducts a case study to identify what went wrong. In this case, the study found that the warning was technically correct, the lead time was within standards, and the public notification system functioned as designed. The failure was on the individual level. The report concluded that no amount of warning technology can override individual human decision-making. That is a difficult conclusion for a community that lost a neighbor. Suggests that the only way to prevent such a death is to change the behavior of people who do not take warnings seriously. That is a challenge that goes far beyond meteorology. The town of Wessington Springs held a memorial service for Dennis Miller on the first anniversary of the tornado. The service was held at the community center, which had been rebuilt with a safe room in the basement. About 300 people attended. The pastor spoke about the randomness of nature and the fragility of life. He read a passage from the book of Psalms about the wind obeying God's command. The service ended with a moment of silence. Then the community walked to the site where the Miller house had stood. The lot was still empty. The foundation had been filled in. A small wooden cross marked the spot where Dennis Miller's body was found. Someone had left a weather scanner next to the cross. It was still turned on. In the years that followed, the warning system in South Dakota underwent incremental changes. The National Weather Service in Sioux Falls upgraded its radar to dual polarization technology in 2012. But the upgrade was not fully operational until 2004. The radar data from the Wessington Springs tornado helped refine algorithms for detecting tornadic debris signatures. The signature of the debris cloud was clear on the radar, but it was not detected in real time because the algorithms were still in testing. After the event, the debris detection algorithm was improved and implemented across the region. By 2016, the system could detect a debris cloud within seconds of formation. That could add 30 seconds to a warning. 30 seconds might have been enough for Dennis Miller to get to the basement. But he no longer had a basement. One more detail deserves mention. The tornado warning was issued at 7:58 p.m. The tornado lifted at 7:37 p.m. The entire event lasted 6 minutes and 44 seconds. Inside that window, a single decision made the difference between life and death. The decision was made by a man who had survived a tornado before. He trusted his experience more than the warning. He miscalculated. The town buried him, rebuilt, and continued to face the sky with a new wariness. But the warning system remains imperfect, not because the technology fails, but because the humans it warns are unpredictable. The story of Wessington Springs is the story of every rural town that lies in the path of a rotating thunderstorm. It is a story of probabilities, of lucky hits and unlucky misses, and of a single moment when a weather scanner blared and a man stayed still. The wind does not care about the warnings. It only cares about the path. And the path on that July evening went straight through the living room. In the hours after the tornado lifted, the town of Wessington Springs was dark. Power lines lay tangled across every road. The only light came from headlights of emergency vehicles and flashlights carried by neighbors. The Gerald County Sheriff's Office had called in every available deputy from surrounding counties. The South Dakota Highway Patrol sent a unit. The local volunteer fire department was already on scene, but their trucks could not navigate streets blocked by trees and debris. They moved on foot. The search began immediately. Deputy sheriffs went door to door calling out names. Some residents emerged from basements and ditches. Others were found walking the streets, dazed, holding torn belongings. The first casualty was reported at 8:14 p.m. A deputy found a body under a collapsed wall on the east side of town. It was Dennis Miller. The deputy radioed the sheriff. The sheriff dispatched an ambulance, but it was clear the man was dead. The coroner arrived at 8:37 p.m. He pronounced death at 8:41 p.m. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and chest. The inquest would later confirm that Miller died instantly when the brick wall of his living room collapsed inward. The tornado had lifted only minutes before. He never made it to the basement. The night operations continued until 2 a.m. Emergency crews brought in search dogs from the state. The dogs swept through the debris field. No other bodies were found. The injured were transported to hospitals in Huron and Mitchell. 5 people were admitted with serious injuries. 1 had a fractured spine. Another had a collapsed lung. All survived. The hospital in Mitchell treated 17 people for cuts, bruises, and shock. By midnight, the emergency was over. The search was complete. The town had 1 dead, 14 injured, and 37 homes destroyed. The cost of the damage was estimated at $5 million. The estimate was revised upward to $6.3 million after a more detailed survey 3 days later. The National Weather Service Damage Survey team arrived the next morning at 8 a.m. They came from the Sioux Falls office, a drive of about 90 minutes. The team consisted of 2 meteorologists and 1 engineer from the National Severe Storms Laboratory. They began the survey at the southwestern edge of the damage path, near the county road where the tornado first touched down. They used GPS units to map the debris field. They took photographs of every damaged structure. They measured the width of the damage path, the length of the path, and the distance between isolated damage indicators. By noon, they had a preliminary assessment. The tornado was rated EF2 on the enhanced Fujita scale. Maximum wind speeds estimated at 130 miles per hour. Path length, 7.2 miles. Maximum width, 300 yards. The rating was based on damage to a well-anchored brick home that was completely destroyed. The engineer noted that the home's foundation was poorly constructed, which likely contributed to the collapse. If the home had been built to modern code, it might have remained standing. But it was built in 1938. The codes did not apply. The survey team also examined the warning timeline. They retrieved radar data from the storm. The mesocyclone signature was detectable on radar at 7:25 p.m. The NWS issued the warning at 7:30. The tornado touched down at 7:31. The survey team found that the warning was issued 1 minute before the tornado touched down. That is consistent with National Weather Service standards. The lead time was within acceptable limits. The warning was based on a combination of radar signatures and spotter reports. The spotter had called in at 7:29. The warning was transmitted to the county emergency manager at 7:30. The emergency manager then triggered the county's reverse 911 system. The system called all landline numbers in the warning area. It sent text messages to cell phones registered with the service. But the reverse 911 system had a known failure. It did not call numbers that were not in the database. Dennis Miller had a cell phone, but he had not registered it. He had a landline, but it was disconnected 3 months prior because he switched to a mobile-only plan. He never received the reverse 911 call. He did not have a weather radio. He did not have a siren to hear. The only warning he had was the sight of the tornado itself, and he did not act in time. The county emergency manager, during a later interview with the NWS, stated that he had considered installing a siren system in 2010. The cost was prohibitive. He also noted that the town had not experienced a tornado fatality in over 50 years. The risk was low. But the survey team's report included a recommendation. All rural communities should consider installing at least 1 siren in the town center. The recommendation was non-binding. The town council again voted against it. The failure of the warning system was not technical, it was social. The NWS report on the Wessington Springs event used a phrase that became a central lesson: the warning gap. The warning gap is the difference between receiving a warning and taking action. In this case, the gap was created by a combination of factors: no siren, no weather radio, no reverse 911 registration, and a personal belief that home is safe. The report concluded that closing the warning gap requires more than technology. It requires community engagement, repeated education, and a culture of preparedness. The report was published as a case study and distributed to all NWS offices in the central United States. It was also shared with the Emergency Management Institute. It became a teaching tool for future meteorologists. But the report could not answer the deeper question: why did Dennis Miller not go to the basement? The family told investigators that he had survived a tornado before. He believed he could survive again. He had lived in that house for 47 years. He had weathered many storms. He thought the warning was overblown. He thought the tornado would miss him. He was wrong. The human mind is not good at assessing low-probability, high-consequence events. A tornado warning that goes unheeded is not a failure of radar. It is a failure of communication. And that failure is harder to fix. In the weeks after the disaster, the town held a series of public meetings. The first meeting was at the community center. About 200 people attended. The emergency manager presented the warning timeline. The NWS meteorologist explained how the storm formed. The audience asked questions. Many were angry. They wanted to know why the warning did not reach Dennis. They wanted to know why there were no sirens. They wanted to know if the town could be safer. The emergency manager answered honestly. The only way to guarantee safety is to take shelter when warned. But he also acknowledged that the town needed better infrastructure. The meeting ended with a vote to form a committee to study the feasibility of a community safe room. The committee worked for 6 months. They found a federal grant program that would cover 80% of the cost of a safe room. The town would have to provide 20%. The total cost was estimated at $200,000. The town council approved the project. The safe room was built adjacent to the community center. It opened in 2006. It can hold 300 people. It has a backup generator, restrooms, and a weather radio. It is used as a storage room for most of the year, but when a tornado warning is issued, the doors are unlocked. The safe room is a tangible legacy of the Wessington Springs tornado, but it does not solve the warning gap. It only provides a place to go if people decide to go. The weather radio that was placed at the cross on Dennis Miller's property is still there. It is still turned on. It still broadcasts warnings. No one is there to hear them. The lot remains empty. The town has not rebuilt on that site. The family decided not to sell. They said they wanted the land to remain as a reminder. The storm itself was studied by researchers at the University of South Dakota. They analyzed the radar data and found that the tornado formed in an environment with moderate shear and moderate instability. That is a common combination. The study concluded that the tornado was not an anomaly. It was exactly the kind of storm that forecasters miss or underestimate. The study recommended that forecasters pay closer attention to marginal environments. It also recommended that the public be educated about the danger of tornadoes even in low-risk setups. The study was published in 2016 and cited by the National Weather Service in their operational guidance. But the most important lesson from Wessington Springs is still a human one. The town lost one person. That person was not a statistic. He was a farmer, a neighbor, a father. He was 62 years old. He had a wife and 2 adult children. He served on the town council for 12 years. He was known for his dry humor and his stubbornness. His stubbornness is what killed him. The community understood that. They did not blame him. They mourned him. They built a safe room. They held a memorial. They changed the way they thought about warnings. But the weather scanner at the cross still talks to the wind, and the wind does not answer. The National Weather Service released its final service assessment on the Wessington Springs tornado on October 15, 2014. The document was 47 pages long. It included radar imagery, damage survey maps, transcripts of the warning issuance, and a timeline of the emergency manager's actions. The assessment was classified as a high-impact event review. It was not the highest level of review, but it was serious enough to warrant a dedicated team from the NWS headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. The team arrived in South Dakota 2 weeks after the tornado. They interviewed the forecasters who issued the warning, the emergency manager, and the town council. They also interviewed Dennis Miller's family. The family cooperated fully. The assessment identified 3 specific failures. The first was the lack of a siren system. The second was the failure of the reverse nine-onion system to reach residents without registered landlines. The third was the absence of any formal preparedness program in the community. The assessment noted that the town had not conducted a tornado drill in over a decade. The school had a drill once a year, but the general public had no practice. The assessment recommended that every community in South Dakota develop a tornado preparedness plan and that the state require reverse nine-onion registrations at the point of cell phone purchase. The state legislature took up the recommendation in early 2005. A bill was introduced to create a statewide reverse nine-onion database. The bill passed the House but stalled in the Senate. The opposition argued that mandatory registration violated privacy rights. The bill was amended to become voluntary. It was signed into law as the Wessington Springs Act on July 15, 2015. The act allocated $500,000 for public awareness campaigns. It did not fund sirens. The town of Wessington Springs used its own funds to purchase 3 outdoor warning sirens. They were installed on poles in the town center, the school grounds, and the edge of the residential area. The sirens were tested on the first Saturday of every month at noon. The first test occurred on August 1, 2015. The families who attended the ceremony said they felt safer, but the sirens were only effective if people were outside. Inside a house with air conditioning and a television, the sound could be missed. The NWS assessment also examined the performance of the radar. The WSR Rate-8D radar in Aberdeen had detected the mesocyclone at 7:25 p.m. local time. The radar beam was at an altitude of approximately 8,000 feet at that point. The rotation was broad and diffuse. The radar operator noted that the correlation coefficient, a measure of debris and precipitation, dropped at 7:29 p.m. That drop indicated that the tornado had likely already formed at that moment. The warning was issued at 7:30 p.m. The tornado touched down at 7:31 p.m. The lead time was 1 minute. That is a statistical anomaly. Most tornado warnings have an average lead time of 13 minutes, but many tornadoes, especially those that form rapidly in marginal environments, produce very short lead times. The NWS assessment concluded that the lead time was technically acceptable because the warning was based on the best available data at the time. But the assessment also acknowledged that a 1-minute lead time is essentially useless for a community with no sirens and no personal preparedness. The question that remained unanswered was whether a longer lead time would have saved Dennis Miller. The warning was issued at 7:30. The tornado struck his house at 7:33. If the warning had been issued at 7:20, he would have had 13 minutes. Would he have gone to the basement? The family told investigators that he might have. They said he usually listened to storm warnings on his cell phone, but that night he was in the barn and left the phone in the house. He did not hear the warning. He did not see the storm until it was too late. The psychology of the warning gap has been studied extensively since 2004. Researchers at the University of Oklahoma published a paper in 2016 that analyzed the behavior of 23 tornado fatality victims in the United States between 2000 and 2005. The paper found that the majority of victims were over the age of 60, lived in rural areas, and did not have access to a basement. But a significant subset of victims, about 30%, had access to a basement and chose not to use it. The reasons varied: disbelief, overconfidence, desire to watch the storm, a belief that the tornado would not hit them. The paper called this phenomenon protective inaction. It concluded that warning systems must account for human behavior, not just meteorology. The Wessington Springs tornado became a textbook case for protective inaction. The NWS used it in training videos for forecasters. The videos showed the radar loop, the warning timeline, and the interview with the emergency manager. The narrator explained that the warning was accurate but insufficient. The lesson was that a warning is only as good as the response it triggers. In 2017, the NWS introduced a new product called a tornado emergency for tornadoes that are both confirmed and expected to cause catastrophic damage. The product uses stronger language and is often accompanied by a specific call to take shelter immediately. The Wessington Springs tornado did not meet the criteria for a tornado emergency because the damage was not considered catastrophic on a regional scale, but the impact on the Miller family was catastrophic. The Millers never rebuilt the house. Dennis's wife, Carol, moved to a small apartment in town. She sold the farm equipment and leased the land to a neighbor. The cross and the weather radio remained at the edge of the property. Carol visited the site every Sunday after church. She would sit in her car and stare at the empty lot. She told a reporter from the Gerald County Gazette that she could still see the house. She could see the kitchen where Dennis had sat down to eat his supper 20 minutes before the tornado. She could see the basement door that he had never opened. She said she did not blame anyone. She said she had known Dennis's stubbornness for 40 years. She said he would have hated the cross with the weather radio. He would have called it a waste of money. The town council held a formal dedication of the safe room on the second anniversary of the tornado. A bronze plaque was mounted on the wall. It read, "In memory of Dennis Miller, who taught us that warnings are only as strong as the actions they inspire." The safe room was opened for tour that day. About 50 people attended. They walked through the reinforced concrete walls, the double doors, the emergency lighting. The emergency manager gave a speech. He said that the safe room would be unlocked within 15 minutes of any tornado warning. He said the town would also use the room as a community gathering space for movie nights and birthday parties, so people would feel comfortable going there during a storm. But the room has never been used for a tornado. Since 2014, there have been 6 tornado warnings for Wessington Springs. The sirens have sounded each time. The reverse 911 system has dialed the registered numbers. The safe room doors have been unlocked, but no one has ever gone inside. The residents have developed new habits. They check the radar on their phones. They listen to the weather radio in their kitchens. They go to their basements or interior closets. The safe room sits empty. The question remains, why did the community adopt preparedness behaviors but refuse to use the community shelter? The emergency manager offered an explanation in an interview with a disaster psychology researcher. He said that the residents did not trust the safe room because it was not their home. They felt safer in their own basements, even if those basements were not reinforced. He also said that the memory of Dennis Miller had made everyone more cautious, but that caution was directed toward individual action, not collective sheltering. The researcher wrote a paper on the concept of place attachment in disaster response. The paper suggested that people prefer to shelter in familiar spaces, even if those spaces are objectively less safe. The Wessington Springs case was cited as an example of how community infrastructure can be built but not used. The NWS assessment of the Wessington Springs tornado is no longer publicly available on the NWS website. It was replaced by a newer assessment of a different tornado, but copies remain in academic databases. The report is still cited in disaster preparedness literature. The key finding about the warning gap has been incorporated into the NWS's public education campaign. The campaign is called Turn Around, Don't Drown for Flooding, but the tornado equivalent is Heed the Warning, Don't Be a Statistic. The slogan is short, direct, and a little blunt. It was written by a communications specialist who studied the Wessington Springs case. In July 2017, a storm similar to the one that produced the Wessington Springs tornado passed over the same area. The radar showed a broad mesocyclone. The NWS issued a warning. The sirens sounded. The safe room doors were unlocked. Family of 4 new to the area saw the siren and drove to the community center. They were the first people to ever enter the safe room during a warning. They stayed for 30 minutes. The tornado did not form. The storm passed. The family left the safe room and drove home. They told the emergency manager that they felt safe. He told them they were the first. The family then moved away a year later. The Miller property is still for sale. The cross is still there. The weather radio is still broadcasting. Batteries were changed twice by a neighbor, but the radio has not been turned off since 2004. It runs on a solar panel attached to the cross. The panel was installed by a local solar company as a donation. The radio is silent most of the time, but when a warning is issued, a robotic voice speaks into the empty field. The National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for the following counties. The voice is calm, clear, and completely unheard. The wind picks up. The tall grass bends. The cross casts a long shadow across the untouched foundation. The sky darkens, and the radio keeps speaking to no one. At 8:15 in the morning of July 28, 2014, a team from the National Weather Service arrived at the Gerald County Courthouse in Wessington Springs. They carried laptops, cameras, and a stack of survey forms. They had already driven through the damage path the day before. They had measured the width of the debris field, photographed the twisted grain bins, and documented the pattern of tree fall. But today they were there for something different. They were there to interview the survivors. The team set up in a small conference room on the second floor of the courthouse. The emergency manager brought in a whiteboard and a coffee pot. The interviews began at 8:45. The first person they spoke with was a farmer named Harold Jensen. He was 67 years old and had lived on the same property for 42 years. He told the team that he had heard the siren but did not go to the basement. He said he had seen the tornado on the horizon and thought it would miss him. The tornado lifted his barn and dropped it 30 yards away. He survived by lying flat in a ditch. He said he would never ignore a siren again. The team interviewed 11 more residents over the next 4 hours. They recorded each conversation on a digital voice recorder. They asked the same set of questions. Where were you when you first learned of the warning? What did you do after learning of the warning? Did you have access to a shelter? Why did you choose not to use it? The answers formed a pattern. 8 of the 12 interviewees said they did not believe the tornado would hit their specific location. 4 said they wanted to see the storm. 2 said they were worried about leaving their livestock. 1 said he could not get to the basement because the door was blocked by boxes. The team compiled the results into a report that was later published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. The report identified a specific behavioral failure that the authors called optimism bias in the face of escalating risk. The report explained that residents interpreted the warning as a general alert rather than a specific threat to their property. They believed that tornadoes only hit other people. The report concluded that warning systems must not only deliver the message, but also overcome the psychological distance between the warning and the individual. The authors recommended that tornado warnings include language that explicitly states, "This tornado will hit your location." The recommendation was adopted by several NWS offices across the plains. In 2015, the NWS office in Sioux Falls began experimenting with a new phrasing system. Instead of saying a tornado has been spotted near Wessington Springs, they began saying a tornado is on the ground and moving directly toward your location. Take shelter now. This is a life-threatening situation. The new phrasing was tested in a study of 1,200 residents across South Dakota. The study found that the explicit language increased shelter-seeking behavior by 37% compared to the previous phrasing. But the Wessington Springs case also revealed a structural problem that no amount of language could fix. The warning system assumed that residents would have immediate access to shelter. But in rural Gerald County, many homes did not have basements. Some homes had cellars that were inaccessible because of flooding or neglect. The community safe room was built after the tornado, but during the tornado there were only 3 basements in the entire affected area. 2 of them were used, 1 was not. The man who did not use his basement was Dennis Miller. The NWS team spent the afternoon of July 28 mapping the locations of all structures within the damage path. They identified 47 homes, 13 barns, and 6 commercial buildings. Of the 47 homes, only 8 had basements, 3 had storm cellars, the rest had no below-ground shelter at all. The team calculated that at least 30 families had no reasonable place to hide. They could only crouch in interior rooms or lie in bathtubs. The tornado destroyed 21 of those homes completely. By any measure, the death toll should have been higher. Why was it not? The answer lies in a detail that the team recorded but did not emphasize in their report. Of the 30 families without basements, 26 had friends or relatives with basements within a 5-minute drive. On the night of the tornado, several families drove to those homes. They did not wait for the warning to become official. They saw the sky darken, heard the rain shift direction, and made the decision to move. The report noted that these families were acting on a combination of personal experience and social trust. They knew the layout of their neighbor's basement. They knew the route. They knew the door would be unlocked. The Wessington Springs tornado thus became a case study in the difference between formal warning systems and informal social networks. The formal system had a warning gap of 3 minutes. The informal system had no gap at all. The families who drove to their neighbors' basements were already sheltering before the siren even sounded. The warning system was a backup, not a primary trigger. The NWS report concluded that future preparedness efforts should aim to strengthen these social networks rather than replace them. In the years since, the town has held an annual preparedness workshop each May. The workshop is led by the emergency manager and a retired NWS meteorologist. They teach residents how to read radar images, how to program weather radios, and how to identify wall clouds. But the most popular segment of the workshop is the social network mapping exercise. Residents stand up and announce the addresses of their basements. The emergency manager writes them on a large map of the town. By the end of the evening, every street has a marked shelter. The map is printed and distributed to every household. The Miller property remains a vacant lot. The cross and the weather radio still stand. The radio broadcasts warnings that no one hears. But the map on the wall of the community center lists the homes with basements. The safe room remains unlocked, and the residents of Wessington Springs no longer wait for the siren. They watch the sky, they call their neighbors, and they move. The tornado taught them that warnings are only as strong as the trust between the people who receive them. That trust was not built by the National Weather Service. It was built by generations of farmers who knew where the nearest cellar was, who knew whose door would be open, and who knew that a warning is not a prediction but a decision waiting to be made. In that decision, the difference between survival and tragedy is measured not in minutes, but in the willingness to act before the wind arrives. And that is a lesson that no system can replace.